Remember from last week's lecture on research designs that the experimental design is the one that you want to choose if your goal is to determine cause and effect. Well, there are some times when you're just not going to be able to do an experiment. And in those situations, you probably don't want to just give up and say, well, I guess we can't do research. The two types of reasons, you might call them ethical and practical reasons. For example, imagine that you were interested in the effects of spanking on children's behavior. If you were to do an experiment, you'd have to take 100 pairs of parents, say, randomly divide them into two groups. Your experimental group would be required to spank their children anytime they committed any infraction whatsoever, even if they don't want to. So you might imagine that there may be some difficulties in getting a study like that approved by an ethical review board. Turns out there are some experiments that have been done, but it is actually pretty unusual to get those things approved. Second situation, suppose you were interested in something like the differences between men and women. Right? You're certainly not going to be able to randomly assign people to be a man or a woman, so you're not going to be able to do an experiment in that situation either. What people have developed, however, are two alternative research designs that you can use that will help you get close to being able to make that good, solid causal conclusion like you would do with a true experiment. But because they're not fully true experiments, you can't be quite as confident in your causal conclusions. First one is called quasi-experimental design. Probably a hard one for people because they're not familiar with the prefix quasi. You can think of it as a prefix that means sort of like. More technically, it means having some of the features, but not all of the features. So the quasi-experiment has some of the features of an experiment, but not all of the features of an experiment. In other words, it's sort of like an experiment. The features that it does have, it will have something that will look like an independent variable. The feature that it's missing, that it doesn't have, it does not have random assignment. So what you'll end up doing is taking some pre-existing group differences and treating them as if they were an independent variable. So that's the example on the previous slide about men versus women. You can't randomly assign people to be men and women, they just are. So we'll take those group differences and we'll act as if it's an independent variable. On the quiz, you might remember seeing a question about the differences between Chicago Cubs and Chicago White Sox fans. Again, you're not going to randomly assign people to be fans of different baseball teams. They just are. So we're going to use those pre-existing group differences and think of them as an independent variable. The longitudinal study design, that's where you're just going to take the same research participants and follow them over time. Okay? That's the research design that has been chosen the most often for the research question of what happens to kids when they are spanked. You take, say, 100 sets of parents, and you'll follow them and their children over time. So take some measurements when the kids are very young, presumably before the parents have started any kind of physical punishment, any kind of spanking, and you'll measure things like how well behaved the kids are, what the quality of the relationship between the parent and kids are, and how aggressive the kids are, and things like that. And then 6 months later, you'll come back and you'll take measurements of those same characteristics, but you'll also now keep track of who's getting spanked and who's not. And what you find is that the kids whose parents spanked them end up being worse behaved, more aggressive, have a poorer quality of relationship with the parents and the children. Does that mean for sure that the spanking caused those things? No, it doesn't. The kids might have actually developed those problem behaviors first, and then the spanking happened. But if you think about the design the way I described it a few minutes ago, and they looked at them in the beginning, and the kids' behavior was equal, and it's only the kids who are spanked who end up having these poor outcomes. And so it turns out that most observers have drawn the conclusion that spanking causes these poor outcomes. Again, we'd be more confident if we had a lot of experimental research making that case. But that's a pretty good trade-off, right? We don't have to actually force people to spank when they don't want to, and we're able to make at least a reasonably confident causal conclusion as a result of this. Last thing to point out, down at the bottom of the slide here, these are correlational designs, right? So even though they don't use that correlation coefficient necessarily, as we saw illustrated in the earlier material, they are indeed correlational designs.